Good morning, my magnificent young entrepreneurs. Are you ready to learn some law and make some money? Okay, today we're going to talk about what happens when you don't have enough money. We're going to talk about debtors' rights and obligations, debtor and creditor matters, and also bankruptcy. So to begin with, we talk about the laws that apply to professional debt collectors, that is, debt collection agencies, and perhaps even your business if you are in the business of regularly collecting unpaid debts. And if you are in business, sooner or later you are going to have a problem with collecting an unpaid bill, because that's part of human nature. Some people get in over their heads for good reasons or bad reasons, and they cannot pay. And what do you do then? Well, if you are a professional debt collector, the state of California unfair debt collection statutes may apply to you, and they begin in California Civil Code section 1788. And there is also a Federal Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. I'm going to read to you now some of the rules and restrictions that there are on debt collection practices, and some of you will get upset or angry or confused because you will know, if you have had debt collectors hounding someone in your home, that they regularly break these laws. They do that because there's not very good enforcement of those laws, and because they expect that you don't know the laws, and so you're not going to fight for your own legal rights. But here are the laws that apply to debt collection agents. First of all, the first time that a debt collector contacts you, they have to disclose to you in the communication that they are calling for the purpose of collecting a debt, and any information that they get from you in the conversation may be used to collect that debt. They have to notify you in writing, if they're a debt collection agency, within 5 days of the first time that they contact you, that you have the right to dispute the amount of the debt if you don't feel like that's the actual amount that you owe. Here's one that will really surprise you if you've ever been in a household where some debt collector is calling you 5 and 10 and 20 times a day. You have the legal right to tell them to stop calling you, and they have to stop. Now, you may not want to tell them to stop, because that may be the triggering point where they decide to go ahead and file a debt collection lawsuit against you, but they do have to stop calling you. I would recommend, if you're going to tell them to stop, you do it in writing by a letter that you send certified mail, return receipt requested, so that you have a written receipt. And that way, if they don't stop contacting you and you go to sue them for a debt collection tort, you have written proof that they did receive notice to stop contacting you, because they may deny it in court if the stop order is just verbally over the phone and you don't have a record of it. Here's one that'll make some of you crazy. A debt collector is only allowed to contact you at reasonable times of the day. And reasonable times of the day are usually interpreted as after 8 a.m. in the morning or earlier than 9 p.m. at night. So those of you that have been hounded by a debt collector at 2 o'clock in the morning and midnight and that kind of stuff, 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, those people are breaking the law, and you can report them, and they may be subject to criminal penalties, or they may be subject to civil tort for unlawful debt collection practices. Now, here's another one. Many times a debt collector will call you up and they will say, if you don't pay this bill right away, we're going to contact your neighbors or your relatives or your employer, and we're going to tell them that you're a deadbeat and you don't pay your bills. And we also have a notice going out in the newspaper of all the deadbeat people that won't pay their bills, and we're going to post your name in the newspaper as someone that won't pay their bills. It is illegal for a debt collector to inform other third parties that you owe a debt, and it is illegal for them to publish your name in the newspaper or make any publication of the fact that you have an unpaid debt. So if they do any of those things, you could sue them, and although they threaten to do that stuff on a regular basis, they usually don't, because they know that that would get them in trouble. Now, here's a side note about that, though, for small business owners. One thing you want to be careful about. I still see this from time to time in small businesses up in the Auburn area. When people pay you with a check and they bounce the check, they have less and less of that now because they have the debit cards and all that. But If they pay it with a check and the check bounces, there's a habit in some small businesses to post those bounced checks on the wall near the cash register, and that way when the cashier is standing up there taking a new check from a person, they can look at the bounced checks, and if you're someone that bounced a check to them in the past, they're not going to accept your check the second time. Well, that's okay if no one can see those checks but the cashier. But sometimes, as an added note of kind of sourness, the small business owner posts those checks on the wall where every customer who comes in to pay their bill can see, oh my gosh, George Smith bounced a check to this business. He must be a deadbeat. I don't want to take any checks from him. If you do that, you're breaking the debt collection law. You're making a public posting of an unpaid debt, and you could end up getting sued for a debt collection tort. So if you post those checks by your cash register, make sure you do it in such a way that members of the public cannot see it, else you may end up getting sued. Of course, it's illegal to use or to threaten the use of physical violence to collect a debt. You can't send Uncle Louie out there with a tire iron and say, if you don't pay this bill, we're going to break your kneecaps. I did have something like that happen in my law office one time. It was rather bizarre. One of my clients that was in a bankruptcy called me and said, so-and-so's here and he wants me to pay his bill. And I said, well, just tell him, you're in a bankruptcy and you don't have to pay the bill, and tell him to go away. And he said, well, it's kind of tough to do that because he's holding a gun on me right now. Well, there's the civil rules of law, and then there's what you do when your life is in danger. But that's another story. Now, here's a big one. A debt collector cannot falsely represent himself as any kind of a government agent. A standard illegal and unethical tactic that some debt collectors use is they call you up and they say, this is Deputy Sheriff so-and-so, and I just want to give you a heads up. We just got a call and we're being sent out to your house right now to arrest you because of your failure to pay debts. But if you could just get the payment sent in to so-and-so in the next hour before we get there to pick you up, we could cancel the arrest order. Well, they can't arrest you in the United States for the failure to pay a debt. Maybe if you're engaged in some kind of fraud, maybe then, but not for the failure to pay a debt. We do not have debtor's prison in this country. We outlawed that about 1895. So you're not going to go to jail for failure to pay a debt. And that guy is not a deputy sheriff, and you don't have to panic and pay that bill because he's falsely representing himself to be one. It's against the law for him to do that. Here's another one that may interest some of you. A debt collector cannot call you so many times that it constitutes unreasonable frequency. So if you've been called 10 or 20 times a day, you know what the horror that's like. And actually, in the law, what's too frequent and what's a reasonable number of times to contact you? 2 or 3 times a week is considered not unreasonable. Anything more than that is considered unreasonable frequency, which may constitute harassment, and you may be able to sue them for debt collection tort. Of course, a debt collector is not allowed to use profane, obscene, or abusive language when they talk to you on the phone, and of course, some of them violate that on a regular basis too. They cannot contact third parties, as I said before, but particularly they cannot contact your employer and tell them that you owe a debt. They can contact your employer one time for the purpose of verifying whether or not you work there if you haven't kept them informed of your current address and they're searching for you. And after they obtain a court judgment against you, then they can contact your employer to garnish your wages. But all that stuff about how we're going to start seizing your wages right now or contact your employer if you don't pay us right now, that's all a bunch of baloney. They cannot seize your wages until after they take you all the way through a court lawsuit and get a judgment against you. So those are the limitations that are in place by law upon professional debt collectors. And the next thing we're going to talk about is your obligations as a debtor What are your legal duties and obligations to your creditors?